On the morning of April 21, 2011, a young nursing student did not leave her home as planned. She was expected to attend classes later that day. Instead, she was last seen outside her family's house in rural Decatur County, Tennessee. Within hours, her absence triggered a search that would expose uncertainty, missed clarity, and decisions made with limited information.
What was reported early did not match what investigators would later confirm. Initial observations created confusion rather than direction. The uncertainty surrounding those first moments shaped everything that followed. What appeared minor at first became critical later. The timeline of that morning would be examined repeatedly over the next decade, with each detail carrying weight far beyond how it first appeared.
If you value investigations that stay focused on verified facts and documented process, consider subscribing. These reports are built carefully, without exaggeration, and with accountability at the center. Holly Bobo lived with her parents and brother near Parsons, Tennessee. The area was rural, with wooded land surrounding the home and limited nearby traffic.
That morning, her brother noticed activity outside the house involving a man he did not recognize. At the time, there was no immediate indication of danger. The interaction appeared brief, and there was no visible struggle that could be confirmed later. Shortly afterward, Holly did not respond to calls or messages. Her family began checking the property and nearby areas. When those efforts failed, they contacted law enforcement.
Deputies arrived and treated the situation as a missing person report. There was no confirmed evidence at that point that a crime had occurred. That classification shaped the earliest response. Officers searched the immediate area around the home, including nearby woods and paths. Family members and neighbors joined the effort. The terrain was dense, limiting visibility and slowing progress. Early searches focused on the possibility that she was injured or disoriented nearby. That assumption guided resource allocation during the first critical hours. Investigators documented items found near the house and noted what could not be accounted for. Some observations raised concern, but none provided clear direction. Without physical evidence establishing a crime, law enforcement avoided conclusions. This restraint was intentional, but it also delayed the shift toward a broader investigative approach. As the day continued, state agencies were notified and search efforts expanded. Volunteers increased in number. Media attention followed. The disappearance became known across the region within hours. Despite the scale of the response, there was still no confirmed trail to follow. By evening, officials acknowledged that the situation was no longer a routine absence. Resources were increased, and planning shifted toward longer-term search operations. Even then, the lack of confirmed evidence limited investigative certainty. What had happened outside the house that morning remained unclear. Those early hours would later become central to the investigation. Statements given, actions taken, and assumptions avoided or adopted would all be reviewed in court years later. The absence of immediate clarity did not reflect inaction. It reflected the limits of what could be proven at that time. The morning ended without answers. What began as a missing person report would eventually become one of Tennessee's most scrutinized criminal investigations. The events of that day would be dissected repeatedly, not because of what was known, but because of what was not. Law enforcement response expanded quickly after the initial report. Deputies from Decatur County began coordinating searches around the Bobo property and the surrounding wooded areas. The focus remained on proximity. The working assumption was that Holly Bobo had not traveled far, either by choice or ability. That assumption shaped how resources were deployed during the first hours. Search teams concentrated on trails, fields, and dense tree lines near the home. Volunteers joined deputies, moving on foot through uneven terrain. Visibility was limited and progress was slow. The area contained thick undergrowth and natural obstacles that made systematic coverage difficult. Despite the effort, nothing emerged that could clearly explain her absence. Investigators documented items found near the house and noted what was not accounted for. Some observations raised concern, but none provided direct confirmation of a crime. Without physical evidence establishing violence, the response remained structured around a missing person framework rather than a criminal investigation. That distinction influenced priorities and timing. As hours passed, coordination widened. The Tennessee Bureau of Investigation was notified and began assisting with planning and logistics. Search grids were expanded. Aerial resources were considered. Canine units were deployed in an attempt to identify scent trails. Results were limited. No confirmed path could be established beyond the immediate area. Public attention grew rapidly. News coverage brought additional volunteers and pressure for answers. Community members searched their own properties and nearby land. Tips began arriving, though most lacked verifiable detail. Investigators recorded each report, aware that early information can be unreliable, but still necessary to document. The absence of clear direction created challenges. Decisions had to be made about where to focus effort and when to shift strategies. Early searches emphasized speed over depth. That approach reflected urgency, but also risked overlooking subtle evidence. At the time, those choices were made without the benefit of later understanding. As daylight faded, officials faced a difficult balance. Continuing large-scale searches overnight posed safety concerns. Scaling back risked losing momentum. Operations were adjusted rather than stopped, with limited personnel remaining active while planning resumed for the following day. The classification of the situation remained significant. Without confirmation of violence, investigators avoided language that could misrepresent what was known. That restraint was intentional. It protected the integrity of the investigation, but also delayed broader criminal procedures that require specific thresholds. Family members pressed for answers while cooperating with authorities. Their focus remained on finding Holly alive. Investigators shared that priority even as uncertainty increased. The lack of immediate evidence forced reliance on possibility rather than confirmation. By the next morning, the scope of the response had grown. Organized search teams returned to the area. Additional resources were deployed. Despite the scale, progress remained limited. No physical trail extended beyond the property. No verified sightings emerged. In hindsight, some early decisions would later be scrutinized. At the time, they reflected the information available and the constraints investigators faced. The absence of obvious evidence did not indicate inaction. It indicated limitation. Those first days established patterns that would persist. Assumptions formed early influenced later interpretation. The lack of clarity hardened into frustration as days turned into weeks. What was not found became as important as what was. The early search efforts demonstrated urgency, cooperation, and community involvement. They also revealed how uncertainty can shape outcomes. Without clear evidence to guide direction, even extensive effort can fail to produce answers. What remained after those initial days was a growing sense that something serious had occurred. The investigation had not yet reached that conclusion officially, but the reality of prolonged absence forced reevaluation. The search phase had ended without resolution, setting the stage for a different kind of inquiry that would unfold slowly over the years ahead. Days passed without confirmation of where Holly Bobo had gone. Search activity continued, but the tone changed as time moved forward without results. The absence could no longer be explained by disorientation or temporary separation. Investigators adjusted their focus, widening the area of interest and reassessing earlier assumptions. Search operations expanded beyond the immediate surroundings of the family home. Crews moved into more remote wooded areas across Decatur County. The terrain was difficult and uneven, with thick brush and limited access points. Progress required coordination and patience rather than speed. Each location was documented carefully, even when no evidence was recovered. As weeks turned into months, the investigation remained active but unresolved. Tips continued to arrive from the public. Some reports suggested sightings, others pointed to rumors circulating in the community. Investigators recorded each lead and evaluated credibility before allocating resources. Many tips could not be verified. None led directly to Holly's location. The shift from search to investigation was gradual. Law enforcement did not announce a change publicly, but internal strategy evolved. Attention moved toward reconstructing events surrounding the disappearance rather than locating a missing person nearby. This adjustment reflected reality rather than conclusion. The lack of progress forced reconsideration. Nearly 3 years later, in December 2014, a hunter discovered human remains in a wooded area of Decatur County. The location was remote and not easily accessible. Authorities secured the area and initiated forensic examination. The confirmation immediately altered the direction of the investigation. Forensic analysis confirmed that the remains belonged to Holly Bobo. The confirmation ended uncertainty about her whereabouts while introducing a more difficult truth. The investigation now centered on determining how she died and who was responsible. The confirmation was communicated carefully with respect for family and community. The condition of the remains limited what could be established immediately. Time and environmental exposure had reduced available information. Investigators relied on what could still be documented, including location, clothing remnants, and any recoverable material. Each detail was logged with the understanding that future advances might later provide clarity. The confirmation of death prompted renewed attention from state agencies. Resources were redirected toward building a prosecutable narrative based on evidence rather than absence. Investigators revisited earlier statements and re-examined decisions made during the first days. The goal was not to assign blame for past actions, but to identify gaps that might now be addressed. Public response shifted alongside the investigation. The discovery confirmed what many had feared while still leaving major questions unanswered. Community members expressed grief and frustration. The focus turned from hope to accountability. Family members were informed before public statements were made. Officials explained what could and could not be determined from the remains. There was no attempt to offer conclusions beyond what evidence supported. That restraint reflected both respect and uncertainty. The discovery clarified one fact while complicating others. It confirmed that Holly was no longer alive, but it did not immediately reveal how events unfolded. The investigation entered a new phase defined by reconstruction rather than search. Investigators began mapping potential movements based on known information. Attention returned to the morning she disappeared, the surrounding area, and individuals who might have crossed her path. The absence of early physical evidence made this work challenging, but the confirmation of death established urgency and purpose. What followed was a methodical effort to build understanding from limited material. The investigation would now depend on interviews, corroboration, and persistence. The discovery did not resolve the questions that had lingered since April 2011. It reframed them. The direction had changed permanently. The search was over. What remained was the long task of determining responsibility using evidence shaped by time, distance, and earlier uncertainty. After the confirmation of Holly Bobo's death, the The investigation continued without immediate results. Law enforcement worked with limited physical evidence and no clear suspect. The passage of time had narrowed what could be recovered, and the absence of early forensic clarity continued to shape every decision that followed. Investigators reviewed statements taken during the initial response and compared them with later information. Some accounts conflicted, others lacked detail. Each inconsistency required careful evaluation. Rather than drawing conclusions, authorities focused on documenting what could be verified and discarding what could not. This slow process frustrated many observers, but it reflected the reality of working without direct evidence. Community pressure increased as months passed. The disappearance and later discovery had affected a wide area of rural Tennessee. Residents wanted answers and accountability. Media coverage remained constant, keeping attention on the investigation and highlighting the lack of arrests. The attention brought additional tips, but most did not withstand scrutiny. Family members continued to cooperate with investigators while advocating for progress. Their involvement kept the investigation visible and reinforced its importance. Law enforcement acknowledged that the lack of resolution did not reflect inactivity. Work continued behind the scenes, often without developments that could be shared publicly. Investigators examined possible connections, including individuals known to have been in the area, and reports that surfaced after the disappearance. Each lead required corroboration. Many reached dead ends. Others raised questions but lacked supporting evidence. Without confirmation, authorities avoided formal accusations. The difficulty lay in separating rumor from fact. In small communities, speculation can spread quickly. Investigators remained cautious, understanding that false direction could permanently damage credibility and undermine future prosecution. This caution extended the length of the investigation, but protected its integrity. During these years, the case file grew thicker while clarity remained elusive. Advances in forensic science were noted, but available material offered limited opportunity for testing at the time. Investigators preserved evidence carefully, aware that future methods might allow deeper analysis. The absence of arrests became a defining feature of the investigation. Public frustration grew alongside doubt. Some questioned whether accountability would ever be achieved. Authorities responded by reaffirming commitment rather than offering predictions. They emphasized that unresolved did not mean abandoned. Behind the scenes, agencies continued reviewing information, re-interviewing individuals, and tracking changes in technology that could assist later. This work was incremental and often invisible. Progress was measured in elimination rather than confirmation. The years without arrests tested patience at every level. For investigators, it required discipline to continue without visible reward. For the family, it meant living with unanswered questions. For the community, it created a sense of uncertainty that lingered long after the initial shock. What sustained the investigation was the understanding that time alone does not erase responsibility. Even without immediate results, the groundwork being laid could eventually support action. The lack of arrests was not an ending. It was an unresolved stretch marked by persistence rather than closure. As time moved forward, the investigation remained open. The absence of resolution did not diminish its priority. What had not yet been uncovered continued to matter, and the effort to uncover it did not stop. Several years after the discovery of Holly Bobo's remains, the investigation began to shift again. What had remained static for a long time started to move, not because of a single breakthrough, but because accumulated information was finally re-examined with fresh urgency. Investigators returned to earlier material, reviewing interviews and tips that had once been set aside due to lack of corroboration. Attention focused on individuals who had appeared repeatedly across different statements. Some names surfaced more than once through unrelated sources. Others were connected by proximity, association, or timing rather than direct evidence. Investigators approached this carefully, aware that repetition alone does not establish responsibility. Re-interviews became central to the renewed effort. People who had spoken to law enforcement years earlier were contacted again. Some accounts changed, others expanded. Investigators compared earlier statements with later versions, documenting inconsistencies and seeking explanation rather than assumption. This process required patience and precision. Advances in investigative strategy also played a role. Law enforcement reassessed how information had been categorized and prioritized. Tips that once seemed peripheral were reclassified based on new context. Relationships between individuals were mapped more thoroughly. What initially appeared disconnected began to show patterns. The renewed focus extended beyond Decatur County. Investigators examined movements and associations that crossed county lines. This broader scope reflected recognition that earlier geographic limits may have constrained understanding. Agencies coordinated more closely, sharing information that had previously been compartmentalized. Public awareness increased as activity became more visible. Media coverage noted renewed interviews and heightened law enforcement presence. While officials remained cautious about details, the shift signaled progress. Community members recognized that the investigation had regained momentum. Investigators also revisited physical evidence that had been preserved since the early days. Although options remained limited, careful review ensured that nothing had been overlooked. Preservation decisions made years earlier allowed continued analysis as methods evolved. One critical element of the renewed effort was corroboration. Investigators sought confirmation from independent sources rather than relying on single statements. This approach reduced reliance on rumor and strengthened potential findings. Each piece of information was weighed against documented facts. The renewed focus did not produce immediate public results. Arrests did not follow quickly. Instead, groundwork was laid quietly. Investigators documented timelines, cross-referenced accounts, and evaluated credibility. This deliberate pace reflected lessons learned during earlier years. Family members were informed that progress was being made, though details remained limited. Officials emphasized that renewed focus did not guarantee resolution, but it represented commitment rather than stagnation. That reassurance mattered after years of uncertainty. The investigation entered a more structured phase defined by verification rather than exploration. Leads were no longer pursued broadly, they were tested systematically. This approach narrowed focus and increased confidence in the direction being taken. As information aligned, investigators prepared for action that would require strong evidentiary support. Decisions were no longer speculative. They were based on accumulated documentation and corroborated statements. What distinguished this period was discipline. The investigation moved forward not through dramatic discovery, but through careful reevaluation. The work remained largely unseen, but it reshaped understanding of what had happened. The renewed focus marked a turning point. After years without arrests, the investigation began to approach accountability. The groundwork established here would soon lead to decisions that would alter the course of the case and the lives connected to it. In the spring of 2015, the investigation reached a point that few in Decatur County expected. After years of uncertainty, law enforcement announced arrests connected to the death of Holly Bobo. The announcement came after sustained investigative work that had unfolded quietly over time. For many residents, the news was sudden. For investigators, it was the result of accumulated information finally meeting evidentiary standards. Zach Adams was taken into custody, followed by arrests of others believed to be involved in related actions. Charges varied based on alleged roles, ranging from murder to facilitation and concealment. Authorities emphasized that the arrests were supported by statements, corroboration, and physical findings that had been carefully reviewed. The move signaled confidence that the investigation had reached the defensible point. Public reaction was immediate. In a community that had lived with unanswered questions for years, the arrests altered perception overnight. What had long felt unresolved now carried names and faces. Media attention intensified, and court proceedings became the focus of statewide coverage. Investigators explained that the arrests were not based on a single confession or isolated tip. Instead, they reflected a broader pattern of information that aligned over time. Statements from multiple individuals, combined with physical evidence and reconstructed movements, formed the basis for action. Officials avoided detailed public explanation, citing the need to protect the integrity of upcoming proceedings. Family members of Holly Bobo were informed before public announcements. Their response combined relief and restraint. Years of waiting had ended, but legal proceedings were only beginning. Officials acknowledged the emotional weight of the moment while maintaining focus on procedure. The legal process moved quickly after the arrests. Court appearances followed, and charges were formally presented. Defense teams challenged the basis for detention and the reliability of certain witnesses. Prosecutors outlined their intent to demonstrate responsibility through corroborated evidence rather than speculation. The community grappled with the implications. For some, the arrests confirmed long-held suspicions. For others, they raised new doubts. Public opinion divided, reflecting the complexity of the investigation and the seriousness of the allegations. Law enforcement refrained from commentary beyond factual updates. The arrests also exposed the role of cooperating individuals. Some had received immunity or reduced charges in exchange for testimony. This aspect would later become central to legal debate. At the time, officials emphasized that corroboration remained essential and that no single statement stood alone. The shift from investigation to prosecution marked a decisive change. The work that had been largely invisible became subject to public examination. Every action taken by investigators would now be scrutinized in court. The arrests did not conclude the story. They began a new chapter defined by legal challenge rather than search. What had been assembled over years would now be tested against legal standards of proof. For the community, the shock came not only from the arrests themselves, but from the realization that resolution would be neither simple nor quick. Accountability had moved closer, but certainty had not yet arrived. The investigation had reached a turning point. After years without arrests, names were now attached to allegations. The path forward would depend not on investigation alone, but on the outcome of judicial process that lay ahead. As the legal process moved forward, attention turned toward the individuals whose statements formed a central part of the prosecution's narrative. Several witnesses had provided information linking Zach Adams and others to Holly Bobo's death. Their cooperation became one of the most scrutinized elements of the proceedings. Some witnesses had been granted immunity or reduced charges in exchange for their testimony. Law enforcement and prosecutors explained that these agreements were used to obtain information that would otherwise remain inaccessible. The decision reflected a calculated risk, trading potential punishment for cooperation that could help establish responsibility. The use of cooperating witnesses introduced complexity. Each statement had to be evaluated not only for content but for motivation. Investigators compared accounts against known facts, timelines, and physical evidence. Consistency mattered more than volume. Statements that could not be corroborated were treated cautiously. Defense attorneys focused heavily on credibility. They highlighted inconsistencies across interviews and pointed to the benefits witnesses received for cooperating. The argument centered on reliability rather than denial. Prosecutors responded by emphasizing corroboration, stressing that testimony was supported by additional evidence rather than standing alone. Some witnesses described actions and movements that aligned with investigative findings. Others provided context about relationships and associations that helped explain how events unfolded. Not every account carried equal weight. Investigators documented which details were independently verifiable and which could not be confirmed. The presence of multiple cooperating witnesses created overlap. Where accounts matched, confidence increased. Where they diverged, investigators examined timing, memory, and incentive. The process required careful separation of fact from influence. Public reaction reflected discomfort with immunity agreements. Many questioned whether truth could emerge from individuals who benefited legally from cooperation. Authorities addressed these concerns by outlining standard prosecutorial practice, noting that such agreements are common when direct evidence is limited. Within the courtroom, testimony was examined line by line. Defense teams challenged memory accuracy, past criminal behavior, and changes between statements. Prosecutors responded by presenting timelines and corroborative material intended to anchor testimony in documented reality. The role of cooperating witnesses did not simplify the proceedings, it complicated them. Jurors were asked to weigh testimony alongside physical evidence and investigative context. The burden rested on determining whether the collective information met legal standards of proof. For investigators, reliance on cooperation was not ideal, but it was necessary given the limitations of physical evidence. They emphasized that immunity agreements were granted selectively and only after careful assessment. The presence of these witnesses also influenced public perception. Debate intensified around fairness and reliability. Some believed cooperation revealed long-hidden truth. Others believed it introduced doubt. This divide would persist throughout the legal process. What remained clear was that cooperating witnesses shaped the direction of prosecution. Their statements filled gaps left by time and circumstance. Whether those gaps were filled accurately became the central question of the trial. The investigation had transitioned fully into legal examination. The narrative was no longer shaped only by law enforcement, but by adversarial testing in court. The role of cooperating witnesses stood at the center of that examination, carrying both explanatory power and controversy. As proceedings continued, the weight placed on these accounts would determine much of what followed. Their credibility, challenged and defended repeatedly, would influence verdicts and appeals alike. Court proceedings brought the investigation into public view. What had been assembled quietly over years was now examined under legal standards. The courtroom became the place where evidence, testimony, and procedure were tested in full view of the community. Prosecutors outlined their theory through a sequence of witnesses and material exhibits. Their approach focused on linking statements, movements, and recovered information into a coherent narrative. Each element was introduced with attention to verification. The goal was to show how separate pieces aligned, rather than relying on any single source. Physical evidence played a limited but important role. Items recovered during the investigation were presented alongside forensic analysis. Time had reduced what could be demonstrated scientifically, but location and documentation still mattered. Prosecutors emphasized chain of custody and preservation decisions made years earlier. Witness testimony occupied much of the proceedings. Individuals who had cooperated with investigators described actions, conversations, and associations relevant to the allegations. Their accounts were introduced carefully, with attention to consistency and corroboration. Prosecutors highlighted where testimony matched documented facts. Defense teams challenged this approach vigorously. Cross-examination focused on credibility, memory, and incentive. Attorneys questioned why statements changed over time and how immunity agreements might influence recollection. The strategy aimed to create reasonable doubt rather than offer an alternative explanation. The courtroom atmosphere reflected tension rather than spectacle. Proceedings moved methodically, shaped by evidentiary rules and judicial oversight. Objections were raised and ruled upon. The judge controlled pacing and ensured procedure was followed. Jurors were presented with complex information. They were asked to evaluate not only what was said, but why it was said and how it fit with other evidence. Instructions emphasized weighing credibility and corroboration rather than emotion or speculation. The absence of direct forensic linkage increased reliance on testimony and circumstantial alignment. Prosecutors addressed this directly, arguing that convergence of independent sources can meet legal standards. Defense teams countered by stressing gaps and uncertainty. Media coverage intensified during the trial. Observers reported daily developments, focusing on witness testimony and legal arguments. Public discussion mirrored the courtroom divide, with opinions shaped by differing interpretations of the same material. Family members attended proceedings, maintaining presence without public commentary. Their focus remained on the process rather than publicity. Officials acknowledged the emotional weight of the trial while maintaining professional distance. The court also addressed procedural matters, including admissibility and scope. Decisions on what the jury could consider influenced how the narrative unfolded. These rulings shaped the boundaries within which arguments could be made. As the presentation concluded, both sides summarized their positions. Prosecutors argued that the assembled evidence established responsibility beyond reasonable doubt. Defense teams maintained that reliance on compromised testimony left critical questions unresolved. The jury was instructed on legal standards and deliberation began. The process moved out of public view, leaving only anticipation. What followed would determine how years of investigation translated into legal outcome. The courtroom phase transformed investigation into judgment. Facts were no longer assembled quietly. They were contested openly. The result would define accountability under law, even as broader debate continued beyond the courtroom walls. The jury returned with decisions that carried lasting weight. After reviewing testimony, exhibits, and arguments, verdicts were delivered that established legal responsibility for some defendants, while leaving other questions unresolved. The outcome reflected how the evidence had been received and how credibility had been assessed under law. Zach Adams was found guilty of first-degree murder and aggravated kidnapping. The verdict rested on the jury's determination that the combined evidence met the required standard. The decision acknowledged the role of testimony, corroboration, and circumstantial alignment presented during trial. The conviction marked the first time legal accountability had been formally assigned for Holly Bobo's death. Jason Outry was also convicted on charges connected to his involvement. His conviction reflected findings related to assistance and participation after the crime. The jury concluded that his actions met the legal threshold for guilt as charged. Sentencing followed statutory guidelines, resulting in a lengthy prison term. Other defendants faced different outcomes. Some charges were dismissed or reduced based on legal rulings and evidentiary limits. These decisions underscored the complexity of the proceedings and the requirement that each charge stand on its own merits. The results varied because the evidence did. Sentencing hearings followed the verdicts. Prosecutors outlined the impact of the crime and the basis for penalties. Defense teams presented arguments related to mitigation and credibility. The court considered statutory factors and imposed sentences accordingly. Zach Adams received a life sentence without the possibility of parole. The sentencing concluded the trial phase, but did not end legal activity. Appeals were anticipated and later pursued. Defense filings challenged aspects of the proceedings, including witness credibility and evidentiary rulings. Prosecutors responded by defending the integrity of the process and the sufficiency of the evidence. Public reaction to the verdicts was mixed. Some viewed the outcome as long-awaited accountability. Others questioned the reliance on cooperating witnesses and the absence of direct forensic linkage. The divide reflected broader concerns raised throughout the trial. For Holly Bobo's family, the verdicts brought a measure of resolution within the limits of the legal system. The confirmation of responsibility mattered, even as grief and loss remained unchanged. Officials emphasized respect for the family while maintaining focus on procedure. The community absorbed the outcome with seriousness rather than celebration. Years of uncertainty had led to a definitive legal conclusion for some defendants. The process had been lengthy and contested, and the result reflected that complexity. The verdicts did not erase debate. They established legal findings based on evidence presented and evaluated under law. Appeals and post-conviction motions would continue to test those findings in subsequent proceedings. What remained after sentencing was a record of accountability shaped by judicial process. The investigation had moved fully from uncertainty to judgment. The legal system had rendered its decision, setting the foundation for what would follow in appellate review. The outcome closed one chapter of the story, while opening another defined by legal scrutiny rather than investigation. Responsibility had been assigned. The consequences were formalized. The focus now shifted to whether those decisions would withstand continued examination within the courts. After sentencing, the focus moved away from jury findings and toward judicial review. Legal teams for the convicted defendants filed appeals that questioned how the trial had been conducted and whether the verdicts could stand under continued scrutiny. The process shifted from fact presentation to legal argument. Defense filings raised concerns about witness credibility, especially those who had received immunity or reduced charges. Attorneys argued that reliance on such testimony weakened the foundation of the convictions. They also challenged evidentiary rulings made during trial, asserting that some material should not have been admitted or that limitations placed on cross-examination affected fairness. Appellate courts reviewed the trial record rather than rehearing evidence. Judges examined transcripts, motions, and rulings to determine whether legal standards had been followed. The review focused on procedure, not narrative. The question was not what happened, but whether the trial met constitutional and statutory requirements. Prosecutors responded by defending the integrity of the proceedings. They argued that jurors had been properly instructed, that evidentiary decisions fell within judicial discretion, and that corroboration supported testimony presented at trial. The state emphasized that appellate review is not a second trial, but an evaluation of legal process. Several appeals were denied after review. Courts found that the trial had been conducted within acceptable legal boundaries, and that challenges raised did not warrant reversal. These decisions upheld the convictions and sentences, reinforcing the outcome reached by the jury. Post-conviction relief efforts continued alongside appeals. Defense teams pursued additional filings that claimed newly discovered information or alleged ineffective assistance of counsel. Each claim required demonstration of material impact. Courts assessed whether any new assertions could have altered the original verdict. Hearings were held to evaluate some of these claims. Witness credibility was revisited, and procedural history was examined in detail. Judges weighed whether prior decisions had been reasonable based on information available at the time. The standard for relief remained high. Throughout this process, public attention resurfaced periodically as hearings and rulings occurred. Media coverage reflected ongoing debate rather than resolution. Some continued to question the convictions. Others pointed to repeated denials as confirmation of legal soundness. For Holly Bobo's family, the continued litigation prolonged exposure to the case. Each filing reopened discussion that had not fully settled. Officials acknowledged the strain while emphasizing that legal review is a right afforded to defendants and a safeguard within the justice system. The appellate process underscored the complexity of accountability in long-running investigations. Even after verdicts, legal outcomes remain subject to challenge. This does not imply error, but reflects the layered structure of the judicial system. As rulings accumulated, the legal position became clearer. Convictions were upheld, sentences remained in place. While challenges continued, their success diminished as courts repeatedly affirmed earlier decisions. The post-conviction phase illustrated the difference between public debate and judicial determination. Courts relied on standards and records rather than opinion. Each ruling reinforced the conclusion that the trial process met required thresholds. The investigation had ended years earlier. The trial had concluded. What followed was prolonged examination through formal channels designed to test outcomes rather than revisit facts. This stage did not produce new answers. It tested whether existing ones could stand. By the end of this phase, the legal framework surrounding the convictions had largely stabilized. The process demonstrated how accountability extends beyond verdicts, requiring sustained review before finality can be claimed. The story moved toward closure, not through silence, but through repeated confirmation. The justice system had continued to examine its own work, and the outcomes remained intact. Even after multiple appellate rulings, legal activity surrounding the convictions did not fully stop. Additional motions continued to be filed, reflecting the length and complexity of the proceedings. These filings did not introduce new narratives about what happened, but challenged how earlier decisions had been reached. Defense attorneys pursued further relief through procedural avenues available under state law. Claims focused on constitutional questions, trial strategy, and the reliability of testimony presented years earlier. Each filing required careful review, and courts examined whether any argument met the threshold for reconsideration. Judges evaluated these motions using strict standards. Review centered on whether earlier counsel had performed adequately and whether any alleged deficiency could have altered the outcome. The burden rested on showing material impact rather than disagreement with strategy or result. Hearings were scheduled when required, allowing arguments to be presented in structured form. Records from prior proceedings were revisited in detail. Courts examined transcripts, filings, and rulings to determine whether any error had occurred that rose to the level of constitutional concern. Prosecutors opposed these motions, maintaining that prior rulings had already addressed the issues raised. They argued that repeated filings did not introduce new evidence or legal reasoning sufficient to justify further action. The state emphasized finality balanced with fairness. Rulings on these motions largely upheld earlier decisions. Courts concluded that the trial and subsequent appeals had met required standards. Claims of ineffective assistance and procedural error were denied after review. These outcomes reinforced the stability of the convictions. Public attention resurfaced intermittently as hearings occurred. Media reports summarized filings and outcomes without the intensity seen during trial. The focus had shifted from determining responsibility to examining process. Debate continued, but its scope narrowed. For the family of Holly Bobo, the continuation of legal activity meant that closure remained delayed. Each new filing revived public discussion and scrutiny. Officials acknowledged the emotional toll while noting that post-conviction review is an established part of the justice system. The ongoing motions illustrated how long major criminal proceedings can extend beyond verdicts. Accountability does not end with sentencing. It includes continued examination to ensure that outcomes were reached lawfully. Despite the volume of filings, the direction of judicial review remained consistent. Courts repeatedly affirmed that the original proceedings had been conducted within legal bounds. The likelihood of reversal diminished with each denial. These hearings did not alter the factual findings reached by the jury. They tested procedure rather than evidence. Their outcome reinforced that distinction. As time passed, the legal landscape surrounding the convictions became increasingly settled. While the right to file motions remained, the substance of review narrowed. The system had examined itself repeatedly and reached the same conclusion. The persistence of legal challenges reflected determination rather than discovery. The process demonstrated the layers of review built into the system, even when outcomes remain unchanged. The story continued not because answers were missing, but because scrutiny is required. Each ruling added to the record, confirming that the verdicts had endured examination across multiple levels of review. The effects of the investigation and trial extended far beyond the courtroom. In Decatur County and surrounding areas, the events reshaped how people viewed safety, trust, and the justice system. What began as a disappearance in a rural setting became a defining event for the community. Public reaction evolved over time. Early unity during search efforts gave way to prolonged frustration as years passed without arrests. When charges were finally filed, attention returned with intensity. Court proceedings placed local residents in the national spotlight, exposing private spaces to public scrutiny. That visibility brought pressure as well as division. Opinions varied sharply. Some residents believed accountability had finally been achieved after years of waiting. Others questioned whether the convictions reflected truth or reliance on compromised testimony. These differing views coexisted, sometimes within the same families or neighborhoods. The length of the process had allowed doubt and belief to grow side by side. Media coverage played a role in shaping perception. Reporting highlighted legal developments, witness credibility, and appellate rulings. As proceedings continued, coverage became more analytical than reactive. The focus shifted from discovery to interpretation. Public understanding depended largely on how information was presented and received. The case also affected relationships within the community. Individuals connected to witnesses or defendants faced scrutiny regardless of their involvement. Rumors and assumptions circulated, often without evidence. The prolonged nature of the proceedings meant that reputational effects did not fade quickly. For Holly Bobo's family, public attention brought both support and strain. Expressions of sympathy were constant, but so was exposure. Each new legal filing reopened discussion. The family maintained restraint, allowing the legal process to unfold without public argument. Their presence remained consistent, even as debate intensified around them. Law enforcement agencies faced lasting evaluation. Decisions made early in the investigation were revisited repeatedly by the public and media. Some questioned whether different choices might have changed outcomes. Officials responded by emphasizing context, available information, and procedural limits present at the time. The controversy surrounding cooperating witnesses continued to influence opinion. Immunity agreements and reduced sentences remained a focal point for criticism. Supporters argued they were necessary to secure testimony. Critics argued they weakened confidence. The debate reflected broader concerns about balance between effectiveness and fairness. Educational institutions and community groups discussed the impact openly. Conversations about safety, evidence handling, and judicial process emerged. The case became a reference point for how complex investigations unfold over time, and how outcomes can remain contested even after convictions. The community learned to live with unresolved disagreement. Legal decisions provided structure, but consensus did not follow automatically. What endured was awareness of how deeply a single crime can affect collective memory. The lingering controversy did not erase accountability established through the courts. It highlighted that legal resolution and public acceptance are not the same. Both exist within different frameworks. As years passed, the intensity of discussion softened but did not disappear. The story remained part of local identity. It influenced how future events were viewed and how trust was measured. The impact extended beyond individuals directly involved. It reshaped expectations about justice, patience, and process. The community carried those lessons forward, shaped by experience rather than conclusion. The outcome of the Holly Bobo investigation illustrates how accountability can take shape over many years through persistence rather than immediacy. What began with uncertainty moved slowly toward judgment, guided by evidence gathered, preserved, and tested across time. The result reflects both the strengths and limits of the justice system. One of the most significant lessons lies in evidence handling. Early decisions to document and preserve material allowed later examination when methods improved. Even when physical findings were limited, careful record-keeping supported continued analysis. This underscores the importance of restraint during initial response, especially when facts are incomplete. The investigation also shows how assumptions can shape direction. Early focus influenced resource deployment and interpretation. While those choices were made within the bounds of available information, they demonstrate how initial framing can affect progress. Reviewing assumptions without defensiveness became necessary as understanding evolved. The role of corroboration stands out. When direct forensic linkage is scarce, responsibility must be established through alignment of independent sources. This approach demands patience and discipline. It also requires transparency about limitations. The process emphasized verification over speed, a trade-off that delayed outcomes but protected integrity. Legal proceedings added another layer of scrutiny. Trials and appeals tested not only evidence but procedure. The extended review reflected a system designed to question itself repeatedly. While this prolongs resolution, it reinforces confidence that outcomes are examined thoroughly rather than accepted without challenge. The use of cooperating witnesses highlighted difficult balance. Such agreements can unlock information otherwise unavailable, yet they invite skepticism. Managing that balance requires corroboration and clear communication about why cooperation is used and how reliability is assessed. For the community, the investigation demonstrated how long uncertainty can shape collective memory. The absence of quick answers created frustration and division. Over time, the process itself became part of the story, influencing how justice is understood locally. For the family, accountability did not erase loss. It provided confirmation and formal recognition, not restoration. The distinction matters. Legal outcomes address responsibility, not grief. Understanding that boundary helps frame expectations realistically. Institutionally, the investigation reinforced the need for coordination across agencies and time. Information sharing and continuity proved essential as personnel changed. Long-term cases depend on systems rather than individuals. The story also emphasizes the difference between certainty and acceptance. Courts reached conclusions based on evidence and law. Public opinion remained varied. Both can coexist without negating each other. What remains after years of review is a record shaped by diligence rather than drama. The investigation moved forward through accumulation, verification, and repeated testing. That process corrected uncertainty and established responsibility within the limits of law. The lessons extend beyond one investigation. Preserve evidence, question assumptions, document carefully, revisit when tools change, communicate honestly. These practices do not guarantee resolution, but they protect the possibility of it. In the end, accountability emerged through process. The path was long and contested, but the record reflects sustained effort to replace uncertainty with verified fact. That outcome stands as the final measure of the work.